Today I'm here to lift the veil from your eyes, to wake you up from the matrix, to drag you out of Plato's cave. I will show you that you've been deceived your whole life. Occam's razor is not from Occam. Hey,
What?
do you know by any chance what happened to the piece of cake that was in the kitchen and was mine?
An alien. No, two aliens. Three, actually. Green ones. They left through a time portal and traveled to the future.
Well, I've got a better theory. You ate it, my friend.
And how's that supposed to be better?
Because entities are not to be multiplied without necessity. What is this Occam's razor thing? It's a methodological principle used in science, philosophy, and reasoning in general, which tells us to favor all else being equal the simplest hypothesis.
I see what you did there.
It's important to pay attention to the clause all else being equal, because Occam's razor doesn't mean we should always in every circumstance prefer the simplest hypothesis. It only applies when all else is equal. Why this clause?
¿Por qué, señor? ¿Por qué?
Well, because sometimes it's necessary to make a theory more complex if that gives us an explanatory advantage, if it helps us better explain the phenomena we observe. For example, if we postulate that besides visible matter there's also invisible matter, matter we can't see, dark matter, that helps explain why galaxies are moving apart faster than our equations predict. The loss of simplicity is balanced out by a gain in explanatory power. On the other hand, if we have two theories that explain the same phenomena equally well, but one does it with 3 principles and the other with 300, that's a good reason to prefer the first over the latter. That's what happened, for instance, when comparing the Ptolemaic and Copernican systems. We ended up preferring the Copernican one because the Ptolemaic model had to keep adding epicycles upon epicycles upon epicycles to explain the same observations. Great, so this principle takes its name from William of Ockham, the main defender of medieval nominalism, the philosophical view that denies reality to universals, partly because they are seen as superfluous and necessary entities. Accordingly, the razor is usually expressed with the famous formula: entities are not to be multiplied without necessity. It was the Scotist John Spons of Cork who, in 1639, attributed this formulation to the scholastics, without naming anyone in particular, and later Leibniz, who connected it specifically with the nominalists. From there, in 1746, Condillac called it the razor of the nominalists. And finally, in 1836–37, William Hamilton called it Occam's razor. But interestingly, this popular formulation, entities are not to be multiplied without necessity, seems post-medieval. We don't find it in any of Occam's actual works. Occam expressed the same principle in other ways, for example the following: nothing should be postulated without reason, unless it is self-evident, known through experience, or proven by sacred scripture. Or, when a proposition about two things is verified, if two are enough for it to be true, it's superfluous to postulate a third.
Come on, no need to be picky. Maybe Occam didn't give the version we know today, but the idea is clearly there. That doesn't mean it stops being Occam's razor.
Wait, hold on. The issue isn't just that the popular formulation can't be found in Occam and is posterior to him. It's that the very idea, the principle itself, predates Occam. Occam wasn't the first to propose it, not even close. In fact, it was already a common principle among the scholastics in the second half of the 13th century. We can find it earlier, for instance, in Occam's own teacher, Duns Scotus. A plurality must not be postulated without necessity. It is pointless to explain with more what can be explained with fewer. We must postulate few where many are unnecessary. But even before him, Thomas Aquinas appealed to the same principle. For example, when presenting an objection against the existence of God, he wrote that what can be explained by fewer principles should not be explained by more, and that because of this there was no need to posit God's existence, since everything we see could be explained by nature or by human freedom. And his reply to this objection assumes the validity of the principle. He doesn't reject it, but rather argues that God's existence is indeed necessary to fully explain what we experience. Also, around 1250, the Franciscan Odo of Rigaud stated the same principle. It is useless to explain with many what can be explained with one. And even earlier, Robert of Grosseteste was aware of the same idea. That which requires less is better and more noble, all else being equal. Thus, the demonstration that, under equal conditions, needs to resolve fewer questions to be perfect is better, whether it uses fewer assumptions or fewer principles. The same applies in natural, moral, and mathematical matters. What requires nothing is best, and what requires little is better, all else being equal. So we find that, far from owing it to Occam, this was an omnipresent principle in the philosophical debates of the 12th and 13th century. But where were all these authors getting it from? Well, to find out we have to go back. Not to the 11th century, not to the 10th, not to the 9th, but to the 4th. Before Christ. Indeed, Occam's razor goes back at least to Aristotle.
Surprise, motherfucker!
By the way, if all of this is blowing your mind, check out the references I mentioned in the description. And hey, give this video a big like because that really helps me reach more people, please. Aristotle writes in his Posterior Analytics, "Other things being equal, the better demonstration is the one that starts from fewer postulates, hypotheses, or propositions." In his book On the Heavens, for example, Aristotle uses this principle to argue that circular motion has no opposite, because if it did, either they would cancel each other out and there would be no motion at all, or one would cancel the other, making it superfluous. And neither God nor nature does anything in vain. When discussing Anaxagoras' thought, who claimed that things were made of an infinite number of archai or principles, he writes, "There cannot be infinite principles, since we can start from a finite number, and it is better to rely on a finite number, as Empedocles does, than on an infinite one. Empedocles believes that with a finite number of principles, he can explain everything that Anaxagoras explains with infinite ones. And when dealing with the question of the number of unmoved movers, we must think it is one rather than many, finite rather than infinite. For when the consequences are the same, notice this, when the consequences are the same, we must always suppose the causes to be finite rather than infinite. Or, in other words, all else being equal, we must prefer the simpler hypothesis." So, there you have it. Occam's razor isn't Occam's. If it belongs to anyone, it's Aristotle's. Now, if you want to keep learning philosophy like a pro, don't miss this other video, where I recommend 5 essential philosophy books for your philosophical journey. I will see you there, and above all, don't forget to think.